One of my early memories from when I was a kid was my dad telling me a bedtime story. Now, I was never necessarily a kid that needed a bedtime story, and if I'm being honest, this is really one of the only bedtime story situations that I really remember. The story that my dad told me was Star Wars, and basically he just told me the plot of the first movie, Episode 4, as I was going to sleep one night. I remember picturing the Death Star as a big star-shaped spaceship. I thought that R2-D2 was two separate characters, R2 and D2. And I thought Luke Skywalker was just a guy that walked around out in space. And now, at this point, as a 28-year-old man, uh, I own 5 distinct copies of the original trilogy, 2 copies of the prequels, all my action figures from when I was a kid, 2 lightsabers, all the in-canon novels, and some other random knickknacks. I also pre-ordered my ticket to the new movie the moment they became available. I'm not sure what spoke to me really so intensely about Star Wars, but I think I have an idea. In writing these movies, George Lucas, who's the writer, director, creator, genius person, he gave us a modern take on the hero's journey, with the hero being Luke Skywalker. We follow Luke from naive farm boy to excited and impatient disciple, to respected leader. And when I put it in those terms, I, as a Christian, sort of perk up a little bit, and I phrased it that way for a reason, because Luke is really no different from the disciples, or really any biblical hero for that matter. Take this guy, for example, right? A young boy is born at a harrowing time in his culture's history. To save him from certain death, he's placed in a, we'll call it lifeboat, and is found by a young woman, and the woman decides that she and her husband will raise the child as their own, despite the fact that they're pretty sure the child is not of their race. The child then grows up, never knowing his true parentage, until one day it's revealed to him that there's a much larger plan to him having been sent to live with another family. His job is to save his people. As Christians, we hear this pretty clearly as the story of Moses, but it also serves another function. It's the origin story of Superman also. Now, I know I'm barely almost 3 minutes in, and I've already made 2 pretty significant pop culture references, plus a biblical reference, and there's not seemingly anything connecting them, but I promise it'll all make sense shortly. Here's what I'm getting at. Here's the question I'm getting to. What happens after we meet these guys? What happens after the origin story? Joseph Campbell was an American mythologist. He spent his life studying stories and myths and studying what connects them across cultures, right? And one biblical, and if you think about it, so many classic stories follow a similar pattern, right? Kind of like how most songs use the same chord structure. Campbell spent his life coming up with why stories work this way, right? What he came up with was what's now known as the hero's journey, right? That's what he called it. Now, he described it in 17 steps. I'm going to reduce it a bit, with apologies to Mr. Campbell. But let's take a look at Luke's journey and compare it with Moses, using this framework, okay? 2 objective heroes of their respective stories, right? First, they both receive a call. Moses receives his from the burning bush. Luke receives his from a princess in a hologram. And what follows immediately after that, right? They're told what to do, and immediately following that, they refuse that calling. Luke says he can't get involved with the big conflict because he's just one guy, right? He's got work to do. The universe is just too big. Moses similarly refuses. He says in Exodus 4:10, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." So basically, I'm not good at talking, so why are you making me? They both receive guides along the way. Luke travels with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Moses travels with Aaron. They both receive supernatural aid in the form of the Force and from God, which are basically the same thing story-wise, but that's for another sermon. They both experience setbacks, challenges, and temptations. They both go through a transformative moment at their lowest point. Luke loses Obi-Wan, his mentor, and decides to honor him by continuing to fight. And Moses basically has a hand in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of young Egyptian boys, which will eventually compel Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go. So with heavy hearts, both of them proceed forward as transformed people, ready to lead through the next challenge. Right? Now that's kind of a 5,000-foot overview of the journey. Campbell's work is fascinating. And there's a man named Alexander Shia who's done some extraordinary work relating the hero's journey to the Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you should definitely check that out if it's something that you're interested in. The point is this, though. Why does Moses follow the same pattern as Luke? I mean, plenty of guys ditched this format, right? None of the disciples really refused their calling. Most of the heroes of the Old Testament, you look at Saul, Abraham, David, Isaac, Jacob, Ruth, Esther, the judges, none of them followed this journey in the way that Moses did. So now, think about your own calling in life, right? I'm willing to bet that you weren't like King David, right? Who was ready the moment Saul anointed him, right? Saul anointed him and he was just willing, right? He was, no doubts, right? Most of us are probably closer to Moses, asking questions and expressing doubts. Last year around this time, I was going through my own Moses moment, right? I was teaching in school. I was teaching music at a school that I loved, with teaching students that I loved, with other teachers that I loved, and yet I knew I was being called elsewhere. But instead of the immediate trust that Peter and Andrew had, or the strong resolve that Ruth and Abraham had, I made every lame excuse that I could to refuse my call. And I think that's more common. People with whom I've talked and met have pretty similar stories to mine, right? With the most important part of the stories being the ending, the acceptance of the call and being transformed. We all have a calling, whether it's to ministry or medicine or law or even like HVAC repair, right? We all have a call. And even if we refuse that calling initially, the refusal pretty quickly turns into resignation that regardless of what we want, our calling is going to happen. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker's adoptive parents are killed after he refuses that calling, and that motivates him into action, right? In Exodus, it's a little more forceful, forgive the pun. That's a Star Wars pun, sorry. God, through the burning bush, gives Moses all the necessary information he needs, right? He says in Exodus 3, verses 5 through 10, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." So that's pretty clear, right? God says, here's who I am, here's what's happening, here's your task, now go, right? But then Moses just keeps refusing the call, just like us, right? Think back to your calling again. In hindsight, it's probably pretty clear what God was trying to do, right? I know it is for me. When I look over the trajectory of my life over the past 4 or 5 years, it all leads right to this moment. But when I heard the call, all I could see were the problems. All I could see were, my own limitations, right? But on the other side, things are great. When you accept the call, when you follow God's call for your life, and when you embrace it fully, things don't get easier, but they do get more fulfilling. Notice, if you look at a breakdown of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the call is step 1, refusal of the call is step 2, and then there are 15 more steps. Right? Receiving and accepting God's call for our lives is just the beginning. From that point, the rest of our lives is in service of that calling. Look again at Moses. When he reluctantly accepted God's call, life immediately got harder, and it continually worsened as he watched the Egyptians, and more specifically Pharaoh, a guy who he probably grew up with. He watches them suffer, but he freed his people. Life wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. We all have a picture. We all have a plan for our lives. Right? Moses just wanted to keep track of his sheep. Superman just wanted to live quietly in Kansas. George Washington just wanted to serve his country. Luke Skywalker just wanted to help the Rebel Alliance. But there were bigger plans in store for them, and anything less than a burning bush, or an oracle from Krypton, or a cryptic message from a princess and an astro droid wouldn't have gotten their attention. And the plans that these guys had for their lives actually kind of came true, right? George Washington did get to serve his country, albeit in a little bit more public way than he maybe would have wanted. Luke Skywalker did get to help the Rebel Alliance. He even got to fight with them and become a general. And Moses got to be a shepherd, but instead of sheep, he was in charge of a nation. Following God's call for our lives, whatever that call may be, is essential. And if you're anxious about it, or frustrated by it, or confused by it, that just means you're in good company. And notice something else. No matter how much Moses pushed back, God never relented. He never said, fine, I'll find somebody else. You're just super whiny. I can't handle it. Just go away. Moses was the right person for the job, and God just kept working on him until Moses finally agreed, albeit reluctantly. In Exodus 4, verses 14 through 17, God finally loses it on him. I love it. He says, "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He's already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it." God gives Moses no more excuses, no out. Right? Moses is the right person, and so God makes it so that Moses can't logically say no anymore. That sound familiar? It does to me. I see that happening in my life all the time, especially in regards to my calling. Whatever my refusal, God addresses it and gives me no out, no way that I can refuse the call and still be considered a disciple. And I'll bet if you're honest with yourself, you see the same thing happening in your life. When Luke Skywalker has his first breakthrough using the Force, Obi-Wan, his mentor, says to him, "You've just taken your first step into a larger world." I think the same can be said of any of us upon accepting our call. We're all called. The only question is whether or not we'll answer it.